Hey there, welcome to First Look. Today, I'm sitting. It's just because I felt like it, and that way I can read the passage a little bit easier. Because I think I need to read this one a little bit more carefully. Because, well, you'll see in a minute. So now we're kind of in this new time that's called ordinary time. It's blank weeks after Pentecost, but you'll see the green, you know, and so it's ordinary time. And so we start that off with Trinity Sunday, and I love Trinity Sunday. And if you go back to sort of the last First Look we did in this past sermon, you'll sort of see me try to play around with the idea of why I think God being presented, revealed in the ways that God is important experientially, emotionally, more than anything else. And so that was kind of what I was playing around with, which I don't think is what I teased at all in the first look. I just decided that I didn't feel like I could take an analogy like that light can be the same thing. I think that's what I said when I was doing this. I didn't think I could take that as genuinely as I wanted to, and the week just kind of hit me more and more that that's what I needed to say. So that's what I started talking about. But now we're into something else, and so what we're going to be doing over the next several weeks is sort of do sort of a deep dive into two different books. So the first one is, I guess it's three different books. The first series will be on the Samuel books, 1st and 2nd Samuel. And so a lot of that will look at the person of Samuel. And then we'll kind of pivot into the book of Ephesians. And so that's kind of the summer. Will be Samuel's and Ephesians. And then whatever else kind of gets sprinkled in here and there depending on what happens, but that's where I'm planning on going anyway. So I thought what I would do is just start you off by kind of reminding you, well, where in the bigger biblical story are we when it comes to Samuel? So let me kind of catch you up sort of from the beginning, if you're thinking about it like that. So you go from creation to, stories that kind of predate history. So stories like Noah, and then you move into Adam and Eve, Noah, and then you pivot eventually into the family, right? The family story. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob's sons who become the namesake for the tribes of Israel. And then they are taken into slavery, and that's sort of by the end of Genesis. And then we pivot from there through slavery, and then we get to Exodus. And remembering that there's literally hundreds of years in between the era of Abraham and his family, and then moving into Egypt and Moses. Right. So then the next several books through Deuteronomy kind of cover the journey of the people, the life and time of Moses, and so we get there. So then we finally get to the Promised Land, and we get to Joshua, and then that's where we enter into a time of Judges. So it's not really one unified kingdom yet. It's a nation of people, but it's not a kingdom in the sense of how it's ruled. So you have this sort of loose confederation of tribes, basically. And they have a judge, which I think, again, is one of those sort of terms that I think gets kind of, that person is literally helping to judge the people when they have things that they need to figure out, but they're also a moral, political, wartime leader. They're usually called upon, or one emerges in times of need. So that time period, you see people who, names that you've heard of, people like Simeon, Deborah, the person whose name just flew out of my head, Samson, sorry, that's what it was, Samson. Individuals like that, right, with big stories and who lead these campaigns and struggle morally and all those things. I need to do something on Samson, I think. But then at the end of that era, you have Samuel. Samuel becomes the last judge of Israel before the kingdom starts, right? Because he's the one who anoints Saul and then eventually David. So that's where we are in the story in terms of who they know themselves to be. So they have the Torah, they have the land, but we're still not into the David era, but we're approaching the David era. So as we enter into the story of Samuel, now we have to kind of have an understanding of where it starts, and that's part of what I hope to do here in the first week, is just to kind of catch everybody up on who Samuel is and what I'm going to base some of at least the first week on. So Samuel has, I think, his own origin story, but then he has this background, which I think are both worth reminding ourselves about. So the origin story that I think we hear often, that I didn't want to preach on specifically because we have, I think, in the last 12 months, is his call story. So Eli is the priest, and he's the one who sort of is taking care of Samuel. And you probably have remembered the call story where Samuel, who is a young boy at this point, hears the voice of God and thinks it's Eli calling him, and then Eli would tell him, no, it wasn't me. And then eventually Eli gets it and goes, this is God calling you. Say this if you hear it again. So there's that call story, and it's usually matched with like Jesus calling his disciples, or a story like that. And that's kind of the beginning of Samuel's, like I said, origin story, the way we understand who he is, that he is one who has a very firm and clear calling on his own life, right? And that propels him into this life of not only priesthood, but judgehood. And so he wrestles with, calling Saul, who he, has his own kind of moral dilemmas with, and then eventually, has his own internal struggle as God calls him to anoint David while Saul is still living, which didn't happen, right? That's not a thing you do. So, that's a part of that will be a part of his story. The story that we're going to hear about today is him becoming a judge. And part of what I wanted to kind of explore was not just remembering where he's been in his own life, that story with Eli, but then going back a little bit further into looking at how he sort of comes to be in this priesthood at all. And it has a lot to do with his parents and his family of origin, and me taking a little bit of liberty and assuming that he knows the story that we also know. Because you have his father was married to two women, and those two women had a rivalry, which kind of spurs on what happens from there. But we'll get back to that in a second. So I want to explore that idea a little bit, because I think, it's the whole premise of this particular week is talking about knowing who we are, right? Understanding that element of ourselves. And so I'm using the story to kind of explore that a little bit. Okay. So let me get to, that's hopefully enough to catch you up. And we're going to be looking at chapter 7 of 1 Samuel. And we're going to start in verse 3. and then go to 17. So this will give you hopefully enough to kind of get us going for this series. All right, here we go. Then Samuel said to all the house of Israel, again, this is him being called to be a judge. So this is all the youthful stuff has already happened. He's established in Israel. He's someone of esteem, right? People know who he is. Okay. Samuel said to all the house of Israel, if you are returning to the Lord with all of your heart, then put away the foreign gods and the Astartes. I can never say that word. From among you. Direct your heart to the Lord and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hands of the Philistines. So Israel put away the Baals and the Astartes. That's probably not how you say that word. And they serve the Lord only. Okay, so first we recognize that there's this foreign god element that which we'll have to explore a little bit more about, like the influence of the Philistines, the influence of the land of the times that the people are in. It's part of how we get to Saul is based on this kind of national pride that swells as they start to try to rediscover who they are. There's a kind of nationalism here a little bit, because what happens is that the influence of these other foreign religions and peoples has clearly weighed on the people, and they've fallen victim to the influence and attacks of other people. That will obviously eventually lead to David and Goliath and the whole thing, but that's a huge element of, I think, how we get to, well, we need a king, because we don't want to fall victim to this kind of false thinking again. But anyway, something to kind of understand as we move forward. Then Samuel said, gather all Israel at Mizpah, and I will pray to the Lord for you. So they gathered at Mizpah and drew water and poured it out before the Lord. And they fasted that day. And he said, we have sinned against the Lord. And Samuel judged the people of Israel at Mizpah, meaning kind of taking on this mantle of those who now he has authority over, right? They're accepting his authority, and he's claiming the authority over the people. When the Philistines heard that the people of Israel had gathered at Mizpah, the lords of the Philistines went up against Israel. And when the people of Israel heard of it, they were afraid of the Philistines. Okay, so this is a pivotal moment in the history. The people of Israel said to Samuel, do not cease to cry out to the Lord our God for us, and pray that he may save us from the hand of the Philistines. So Samuel took a suckling lamb and offered it as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. Samuel cried out to the Lord for Israel, and the Lord answered him. And as Samuel was offering up the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to attack Israel, but the Lord thundered with a mighty voice that day against the Philistines and threw them into confusion, and they were routed before Israel. Okay, huge piece of this. And the men of Israel went out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines and struck them down as far as beyond Beth-kar. Then Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Jeshanah, yes, and named it Ebenezer. For he said, you're Ebenezer, remember that from a psalm, or from a hymn. Thus far the Lord has helped us. So the Philistines were subdued and did not again enter the territory of Israel. The hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. The towns that the Philistines had taken from Israel were restored to Israel, from Ekron to Gath, and Israel recovered their territory from the hand of the Philistines, and there was peace also between Israel and the Amorites. Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. He went on a circuit year by year to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, meaning to judge in those places. And he judged Israel in all these places. Then he would come back to Ramah, for his home was there. And he administered justice there to Israel and built there an altar to the Lord. So you have, again, the last judge of Israel. I don't think that he knew that he was going to be the last judge of Israel, but he becomes the judge of Israel. He sort of claims this and accepts this mantle, and does so in the midst of conflict. And so in this time of need is when you see him kind of claim this, who he's always meant to be. And so that's a really important part. Again, if you think about the history of Israel in the sense of what we see in the Bible, is that what we know is going to happen is that David will eventually become king. And when David becomes king, it's this big unifying thing on its face, right? At least in the terms of strength and David's wisdom and abilities, and growing the kingdom, and then Solomon doing the same. And so you have this kind of the glory days, the golden era, I guess you could say, of biblical Israel. We know that eventually that falls apart, but it's the reason that it falls apart is something that you should be paying attention to now. Because when eventually, after David and Solomon, when the kingdoms divide into two, north and south, a lot of why that happens, which will obviously will divide the kingdoms, make one more prosperous financially at least than the other, but still leads to their exiles, right? The north and south are taken in exile and then brought back and that kind of thing. That a lot of what leads to that starts right here, right? It's because Samuel comes into play, and these tribes, who again are kind of loosely together, but don't have this centralized kind of figure or government, it starts to take form here, right? So we have Samuel taking up the mantle of judge, this threat from the Philistines, this defeating them. There's a kind of like, well, we need to hold on to this idea, right? We need to hold on to this feeling. And so eventually, of course, what it leads the people to, is to say, we need a king, which they'd never done before. So finally, that's what happens. And Samuel, is the one who is there to anoint that king, right? To become that person. That person is Saul. And eventually, there are a lot of people that we won't cover this as much this time, but when we go from Saul to David, there's a huge break there. So the people who are for Saul, they fall back. They fall in line for David, but they don't forget, right? And eventually, because David's really strong, they had to say, we have to submit to this idea because this is what's good for all of us. But the 10 tribes that were much more for Saul, that kind of broke for him eventually, never forgot. And so when we get when Solomon dies, they see their opportunity, and they divide the kingdom into two, and the Saul people become the north, and the David people become the south. Now, that's not something you have to necessarily remember, but it's good if you know that. You'll start to kind of notice in the next couple of weeks as we explore the story. You and I can talk about that, kind of point out the places where we go, this is where that starts, this is what happens, this is the context. But for now, what I want to kind of focus on is the fact that we have Samuel here in this position as judge, and kind of what that might mean. So what I mentioned before was we have the Samuel origin story, and that origin story, again, that Eli call story, that's kind of where we see the person of Samuel emerge. But his story goes back a little bit further. Because again, so his father, and I'm going to forget the name of the two folks. Hannah is Samuel's mother, but I don't remember the other woman's name. Samuel's father is married to two women. Peninnah, something like that, and then Hannah. Okay, so the father loves both of his wives, but especially loves Hannah, and feels terrible that Hannah doesn't have a child. Right, Hannah's not having a child. His father has children with this other woman whose name I think is Peninnah. Now that's okay, that's all well and good, but there's this rivalry between Peninnah and Hannah. For some reason, Peninnah really stuck it to Hannah. I mean, just made fun of her relentlessly. Like, just, I don't know if it's because she knew that her husband preferred Hannah, or whatever it was, but just tormented her. And that's what it says over and over. It was just tormented her. And that's what, and the father was like, why are you letting this woman torment you? Like, just, I love you, isn't that enough? Basically is what he says. Something like that. And Hannah is just tormented by this. And that's what leads her to the temple, which is what leads her to meet Eli, which is what, then the promise happens and the prayer happens, and Eli says, you'll have a son, that kind of thing. And she dedicates him to the Lord, and that's where we get Samuel. And so Samuel was kind of born out of that origin story. And I don't know exactly where I want to take that, but I'm going to assume, I think, that Samuel knows some of that story, or at least understands that there's this divide between his mother and the other woman that his father is married to. And that plays some kind of role. Maybe he has a chip on his shoulder. Maybe I don't know. I haven't really thought through it yet, but like, go back into, it must be right in the beginning. It's like that's where the Samuel starts. So just go back into chapter 1 and read through that part of it, if you'd like, or even pause here and do that. Because I'm always very interested in these parts of the story that we are led into, that as adults must have played a major role in who these people became to be eventually. And that's one of those things that I've explored a little bit when it comes to Jesus, when it comes to David. I mean, I know that I've done sermons exploring the childhood, sometimes the traumas that, for instance, if you need a point of comparison, I was talking about the fact that when Jesus was born, they had to flee to Egypt, and that part of the Jesus origin story was born out of this idea that the king Herod was slaughtered all these children in Bethlehem to find him. That all these innocent people, all these innocent children had died, and all these parents had lost children because they were looking for Jesus, and how that couldn't have, assuming that literally happened, you know, there's no way Jesus hadn't heard of it, hadn't heard about it. It would have been something that that would have been common knowledge. It couldn't be that you lose half a generation of children in one city and that not get around. So how would that have informed the way that Jesus, the adult, saw the world, saw himself, saw his ministry? And I've talked about how him knowing who his mother was, and understanding Mary's way of understanding the world. We see the like Mary's song. Like, do we assume Jesus knew that song and that influenced the way that he saw his mother, saw the world, that kind of thing? And I've done similar things with David, and I kind of want to do something similar with Samuel, because I think that those things have to play a role in who he is. And I think the more that we can get in touch with, if we're reading the Bible with that kind of lens, where we see the people in it as byproducts of, either the traumas or the origin stories or whatever you want to call them in their youth, then that should allow us to get in touch with that for ourselves, right? And maybe start to think more critically about who we are and how we got to where we are, and then how we have influenced our children, in what, how their stories and our stories play into the adults that we have become and that they will become or have become. So I think that the story of Samuel and then David, all of that is such unbelievably rich storytelling, that the narrative part of it, just the tradition that's passed on there is just so full of things for us to really know and understand. We know as much about Samuel as we know about almost anyone. I mean, it's Moses and David and Elijah. We might know more about them. We know the prophets more from their own perspective, right? We know Isaiah through his writing, or Jeremiah through his writing. But in the Old Testament, at least, I mean, so there's Jesus and Paul, obviously, but there's only 4 or 5 people in all the Old Testament that we know as well, and Samuel is, ranks in there. And if he's given that much of a platform, then we should certainly be trying to understand it. That's where I'm starting. So I encourage you to kind of look. I'm looking at the time and realizing that I've kind of exhausted it. So I could obviously talk about Samuel for a while, but thank you for exploring it with me. I hope that when we do a more book-focused study or series, that it hits as well as the other ones that we do. But there's lots of things I'd like to explore. So I'm glad to kind of do this part of it with you. So thank you for doing this with me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. I'm always happy to be kind of getting into ordinary time with you and sort of see where it goes. Thanks for doing this with me still. And I'll see you next time for another First Look. Take care.